Hello everyone, this is Fari and welcome to part 2 of my vector battery replacement tutorial video. So the first thing I'm going to do is, while the soldering iron's heating up, I'm going to remove the harness from the battery here, because a lot of these stock batteries come with harnesses, which is you don't need for vector because there's no clip on there for them. So I'm going to use a wire cutters like this to remove it and then strip the ends of the wire. So usually I'll just cut the harness at the end, and then just strip the positive and negative terminals like that. Because the harness will not fit, there's nowhere to plug in a battery harness into vectors. I'm probably gonna have to turn this down a little bit. So usually I'll just get a little bit on the end and try to make it just so it can fit on the solder pads. So it looks like this. Then I do the same for the negative terminal. Pull forward and it should be clean like this. You don't want it to fray too much. Or it will be more difficult to solder. And then you just want to make sure you might probably need to cut these down a little bit more, but I'll worry about that later. But if you look here, you can see you just want to make sure the positive and negative terminals where they are. And you can see them here. It doesn't matter which order you remove them, but these are the 2 points that you will be desoldering from to get the old battery out. This battery is still good. I'm just going to be putting it in a DVT unit because I want to be able to put longer battery life on the vectors I run more often, because a lot of time you can only get maybe 30 minutes on them, because that's what Anki said they eventually used to make these robots toy grade. So first, usually what I do is just make sure the solder gets hot, and then I pick up the wires to remove the battery. Because I don't generally need to remove the solder, because I just need to loosen the wires enough. Just make sure your iron is hot enough and that you don't touch any more components in the process. Then lift up and see I've got one terminal removed. So I just make sure I just hold the tip at the wire here, so then once the solder melts, I can lift up and the wire should come off. And now it looks like this wire is a little bit frayed at the end. It looks like just the top melted, so I'm gonna probably have to snip this one. But I can try to still remove it. I'm just gonna cut the end there because it's a lot harder to pick up with the tweezers when the coating on it isn't there. But I'll snip it, the end here, just to get the little endy bit off. There we go. And if I'd want to reuse this battery, I would just strip some of this end off, and then make sure that it's, and then just make sure that it's like that the wire isn't frayed. But it should still be able to fit just fine. So I just have to go get my solder, so I'll be back shortly. So now I'm back with the solder, so what I'm going to do is solder the new ends of this battery. I just cut them down a little bit so they'd fit better onto the negative and the positive terminals. Again, the red being positive and black being negative, but if you've done any electronics, you know that already. Just stating it if you're new to all this. Something else, since you probably want vector, you don't want this to be flat when you're soldering it, and since it does have a tendency that the assembly here, the board does have a tendency to tip back, I recommend using something to kind of hold it forward like that. Just anything that you can use it to balance, just anything that you can get the back to balance up a bit, so it doesn't just keep falling backward. So I'm just using this random tool here that my boyfriend set down. But anything should work okay. So otherwise the battery will keep slipping backwards and it'll be a lot harder to maneuver. Because usually I like to hold it with the battery kind of in by the board, so then it's easy. Then it will stay still without sliding around. Then next you want to make sure the wire. So then. And I guess what I'm probably going to do here is just hold the battery like this, and then just try to find just a good spot to set the wires. I don't have the best setup here, but I'll try to find something that works. Just put a little solder on the tip. Then put the end down. Then melt it to the positive terminal. It should be on. And it's important to make sure it's secure, so then the battery doesn't fall off when the robot's running. The negative I'm gonna hold about right here. Get it to stay. Solder on this tip already, so I'll just so a lot of times you don't even need that much solder. A lot of times you can just take what you already removed and just melt it onto the new tips like that. So now that it's on and connected, then what you do is just annoyingly just the way that the battery terminals are on this battery that I got are a bit strange. But you want to make sure that the battery is going to fold underneath here, which it is. I'm just going to have to finagle the wires a little bit so then they're not sticking out so much. And if they pop off, it's not a real big deal. You just solder them back on. It's important to have a way to have them held down. I'm going to push this spike down a little bit just because it's bothering me. But there. Yeah, now they should be down. So then usually the way I do the testing, to make sure that the solder worked, is I just put like the two halves together and I usually just connect the backpack sensor to the flexi board in the back. Once I put these bits back together and do all the back connections, and then just make sure it lights up. So I'm gonna remove my soldering iron and go grab a charger to do that test. It's usually because this the back sensor is a thing that you can get to light up easily, so it's an easy way to test that your solder connections are good, without putting the whole thing back together and realize the soldering isn't working, because that would be a pain in the butt. So I'll just try one of my chargers. This soldering iron's still cooling even after I unplugged it, so always be careful just not to burn yourself. Because I'd be the klutz to do something like that. Again, this is why I'm not an engineer and I just mess around with this kind of stuff. So the backpack sensor is on the board. So usually I use the contacts here, and then there's this little plug-in right here to connect the back sensor to see if it lights up and that you're getting power. And again, it's a flexi, so just be careful and just kind of wiggle it into that cord, and then it should just slide in easy. And then of course, then the light is now on. As you can see, I'm going to turn it so it's a little easier to see on camera, and that the booting lights are on here, so that means that the connection to the robot is complete if this back sensor lights up. So that means this is successful in terms of resoldering it. See, here it is getting power and the light is on. But it's obviously not going to boot like this, since the Vector does require the headboard bodyboard connection, because most of the robot's brain is in the headboard, while the bodyboard controls more the motors and the sensors. So I'm going to unplug this connection here and then put it back on as I get more parts ready. So, but that's just just something that lights up is just the easiest way to test if your solder connections worked all right, before you put the whole thing together and realize that it didn't work. Because that would be very frustrating. So in the reassembly process, the first thing I do is put these two halves back together and connect them. So then this is the front where the neck is, and then we'll start with one half and just carefully just reassemble them and plug the harnesses back in. So like this. Just make sure they all fit okay. Because the way some of the new wires are just, again, the stock batteries had a little bit, the ones of the wires coming out the sides, they came out both on one side because they were meant to be harness wires, which is very common when you get stock batteries like that. A little annoying, but it's not the end of the world. Just something you gotta work around a lot of the times. Then you wanna re-plug in the harnesses when putting the motors back together. And then they won't plug in and if you plug it into the wrong one, they just won't fit. You know you have the right one by the harnesses fitting like this, because the way the notches are fit, make sure they aren't plugged, is a way that they make sure that you don't plug them in the wrong way, or that when the robots were assembled that didn't happen. And another thing I'd like to point out is, like, this spine cable, you want to make sure that it's between, as in this stock right here, otherwise it won't connect back properly into the head mount. So just be careful of that when you're putting the head back together. I'm going to reconnect these harnesses. I can usually just do them with my finger, but if the body like ends up pulling too much weight on the cords, you can always use a tweezers or something else to hold them as well. Because the cord's kind of short and the body definitely pulls a lot on it if you're not holding it down. Because you don't want to bend the pins in the harness itself. But if you have it aligned properly, they should just snap right in. Sometimes I even will pull, yeah, there I just pulled the other half out a little bit to make sure it snapped in. Just make sure everything's aligned all right. A lot of times I'll look at the bottom to make sure the battery is aligning and that there's no extra board or wires stuck in there. Because if it's not sliding in easily, there's probably something stuck in there. After a lot of trial and error, just putting crap together, that's just generally the consensus I've come to. I think I'm stuck on some wires here. Push them to the side. But sometimes the alignment does take a little bit of work to finally get right, because every piece on these robots is meant to fit exactly together. So if it's out of alignment at all, they will not slide in back together easily. So I definitely think I'm sticking on the Rev D board here. I'm not entirely sure why. Because you have to make sure that every slot in the plastic is perfectly aligned. And I can watch this neck bit here to make sure it's in the head mount. Trying to figure out where the hitch point is here. It'll take a second. Seems to be sticking to the front of the board for some reason. Definitely the front is the hardest part to align because the back has all the harnesses in there and it's pretty easy, while the front of the board keeps wanting to slide out for some reason on the left side. There's this wire underneath here, the positive terminal, because I think that might be what's sticking. Because a lot of times when you're doing modifications like this, since this battery is bigger, it's not going to be exactly tolerant to the original robot. Which is why when you're just like when you're doing any modification is that it is gonna it's always there is gonna be a bit of work to work around the tight tolerances of a factory made item like this. And then you see the head connectors in here. So if your head connector is in this hole right here, it's good. You just don't want any wires sticking out of here or here. And ask me how I know that, because I've absolutely done that before when I've put vectors back together, and it's really annoying once you try to put the head back on. So just don't be me and don't do that. So then next, I'll do the back sensor. Or actually, because again, aligning with these robots is always the hardest part. So I just try to make sure I find that back piece and realign that at the same time, usually as the backpack sensor, just to make sure that everything clips in properly. Because these robots are made for everything in the mold to click in exactly as it was planned to be built. So if it's not exactly aligned, it's not going to work. So that's just a very important thing to remember. While it can be frustrating, it's just a part of the deal when it comes to working on these kind of things. And even I don't have like the perfect alignment method down yet, because even this middle bit here is very finicky and has a little notch right here, which makes it much harder to align than if it was just a flat piece. Because it goes into the gear and the notch goes into the head mount, which means it has to be very closely aligned when you're putting it back together. So if I was smart the first time, I would have put this in with this 2 halves and try to align all 3. So for me, reassembly is definitely harder than disassembly, because you're trying to figure out try to get all these alignments to be exact. Because in the molding process, it's just already meant to. That's already meant to be that way, rather than doing a modification like I'm doing, where any slight change can put a part out of alignment. That's just a risk that must be taken. So then after that, I put in the back sensor. Again, be very careful not to rip. But I push close to the end there and push it in until it will no longer slide in on the back. And if you do really want to test the connection, just put it on the charger and go like that. And then you can hold it down to see if it will turn off. Just sometimes, like without a headboard on there, it'll probably act a little bit funky, because all the normal connections are not there. Yeah, so then it's off after a few seconds. And then after you put the back sensor in, I recommend putting this weight in. And that's what makes sure that's how the vector can balance. And again, this is notched as well, so it's going to be a little finicky in terms of realignment. So you might have to separate the halves a little bit to get it to work. Because basically every part in the injection molding that was used for these is notched, which can be annoying when you're putting it back together, but that's just how it is. I actually pop this out and put the weight in, just because it's kind of getting in the way of the alignment. But just do what works for you. It's probably going to take a little bit of finagling to get all the notched pieces back together, just because that's just the nature of using notched pieces. So that everything must align perfectly to work. So now I got the weight in the back, and that's what holds the robot. That's just what makes sure that the robot's head isn't too heavy for its butt, because that would cause a lot of problems with balance and working of the robot. So I'm just gonna reconnect this. Slide should just easily slide. We got it at the right angle. And I just recheck the power a lot just because I want to make sure all my connections are working. And it will just go to like that first boot light because there's no head, and if it doesn't recognize the working headboard, it will just stay on that one light rather than doing the full boot sequence. After that, I'll put the back on, and that just kind of holds together, and then I'll start screwing bits together, because a lot of times with like these body parts, I usually don't wait. Usually I just kind of wait at the end to start putting screws in, just because I want to make sure that all the alignments on the parts are correct before I start putting the screws back in. And then the next bit will probably be to put the IR assembly back in, which again does go with this full alignment. And then that connects up here. And make sure the cover on the IR fits into this top bit here. And that will snap down once it's in. So usually once I make sure I get the body all aligned first before I put the screws together. So usually there's kind of two major alignment points on these bots, which is the head alignment, making sure that everything in the head lines up perfectly, and then the body alignment, which of course you have to do the body alignment to get to the head alignment, or otherwise head's not going to work if body don't work. And then there's a lot of dirt, and then a lot of dirt gets in the wheels, so you can clean those if you need to do that, especially if you have stinky animals that shed a lot, like my cat. So I'm just going to put, luckily the Vector, most of the screws are basically the same, so I'm just going to start. So usually I start with like the embedded ones that are harder to get to, put those back in. Sadly, my long screwdriver does not have a magnetic tip. But if you do have a magnetic tip on your screwdriver, like sometimes I'll use even this one with a magnetic tip to help align embedded screws, and then I'll just use the correct size one to get them to fit back in. Because magnetic screws are something that's really nice to have when you're putting stuff together and taking it apart. So I'm just going to start with the screws that hold the two halves together in the head, in the embedded back one, and then the head mount. And then the ones in the front. I guess the one downside to magnetic screws is that oftentimes the screw will slide if it's not a perfect fit, and it will go off to the side of the screw, but it's still better than it just completely falling off all the time. So I'll probably use my bigger one for this since this magnet's better, and I think it holds slightly better, maybe not much. Because a lot of times with some of these embedded screws are the ones that hold the body together, they're definitely a lot harder to reach than the head screws. And these might not even be magnetic, they might even be plastic. While the older DVTs used like just silver metal screws, the production models use these black, I think either partially metal or completely plastic screws. Because starting with DVT3, they changed from the metal to the black screws. So it seems like the metal ones were more likely to strip, but that's because at the time of the early DVTs, the molds probably were still, I think Anki was still working on making sure they had the right molds for everything. And making sure all that was working okay. And then just make sure you get the screw in here, like right under the IR chassis, because that's a piece that holds the two halves together and that's not part of the IR casing. I really wish these were metal because it'd be a lot easier to hold them together. I think these are completely plastic because it's like, or maybe just slightly metal because they do not stick hardly at all. Then once you have the screws that put the two halves together, next what I do is I put the screws connecting the back and the IR piece together. So these ones on the sides, like right here.